In 1630, a small fleet led by John Winthrop reached the rocky shores of New England. What they found was not a grand city or a promised land, but uncertainty, dense forests, an unfamiliar climate, and the constant risk of failure. Few could have imagined that this fragile settlement would one day become one of the most powerful and influential cities in British North America. Yet Boston's rise was not sudden. It was shaped slowly, through hardship, ambition, and the steady pull of the sea. In its earliest years, Boston was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings gathered around a meeting house. Life revolved around survival, securing food, building shelter, and maintaining order in a place far removed from England. The town's Puritan foundations emphasized discipline, community, and religious purpose, giving Boston a strong social structure at a time when many colonies struggled to endure. Geography soon transformed this vulnerable outpost into something greater. Boston's deep natural harbor opened the town to the Atlantic world, connecting it to England, the Caribbean, and Europe. By the late 1600s, ships crowded the waterfront, carrying fish, timber, rum, and manufactured goods. Trade brought wealth, population, growth, and influence, turning Boston into a bustling port rather than a struggling village. By the early 18th century, Boston had become a city of wharves, churches, schools, and government buildings. Institutions like Harvard College trained clergy and civic leaders, while markets and taverns filled the streets with debate and commerce. The city was no longer defined by survival alone, but by confidence and ambition. This transformation mattered far beyond Boston itself. As one of the largest and most economically vital cities in British North America, Boston became a center of ideas, power, and resistance. The same forces that lifted it from obscurity, trade, education, and strong civic life would soon place it at the heart of a conflict that reshaped an empire and gave birth to a nation. In the early 1700s, Boston emerged as one of the most important trading hubs in the Atlantic world. Its fortunes tied closely to the sea. The city's natural harbor, deep, sheltered, and easily accessible, made it an ideal gateway between British North America, Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. By this time, Boston was no longer a remote colonial town. It was a port city whose docks, ships, and merchants placed it at the center of global exchange. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than at Long Wharf, the longest and most significant pier in colonial Boston. Extending far into the harbor, it allowed large ocean-going vessels to dock directly at the heart of the town. From here, goods flowed in and out at a constant pace. Codfish shipped to the Caribbean, sugar and molasses brought back for rum production, and manufactured items arriving from Britain. Long Wharf was often the first impression Boston made on newcomers, a bustling gateway where sailors, merchants, enslaved people, and immigrants all crossed paths. It symbolized Boston's commercial ambition and its dependence on maritime trade. Guarding the harbor's entrance stood Boston Light, completed in 1716 on Little Brewster Island, as the first lighthouse built in what would later become the United States. It was both a practical necessity and a powerful symbol. For ships arriving after weeks or months at sea, its steady light signaled safety, opportunity, and the end of a dangerous journey. Boston Light made the harbor safer and more efficient, reinforcing the city's role as a trusted and well-organized port within the British Empire. Yet Boston's waterfront was not only about commerce, it was also about control. Castle William, positioned on Castle Island, dominated the narrow approaches to the harbor. Its cannons reminded every arriving ship that Boston was under British authority. The fort protected trade routes, enforced customs regulations, and served as a visible expression of imperial power. Merchants benefited from the protection it offered, but its presence also underscored the growing tension between economic freedom and political control. Together, Long Wharf, Boston Light, and Castle William defined early 18th century Boston. They represented a city thriving on global trade while firmly embedded in the British imperial system. These same structures that fueled Boston's prosperity also made it strategically vital and ultimately a focal point of conflict. As commerce expanded and imperial oversight tightened, the harbor that built Boston's wealth would soon become a stage for resistance, protest, and revolution. As Boston grew in wealth and influence during the 18th century, its institutions became the framework through which colonial leadership, governance, and public life were shaped. Places such as Harvard College, the Old State House, and Boston Common were not merely physical landmarks. They were spaces where authority was trained, exercised, and increasingly challenged as political tensions with Britain intensified. Across the Charles River in Cambridge, Harvard College stood as the intellectual backbone of colonial New England. Founded in 1636, Harvard's original mission was to educate clergy, but by the early 1700s, it had become a training ground for lawyers, magistrates, and civic leaders, many of the men who would later argue for colonial rights or administer imperial law passed through its halls. Harvard instilled classical learning, religious discipline, and a belief in moral governance, shaping a leadership class that was both loyal to British tradition and increasingly aware of colonial interests. As disputes over taxation and authority grew, this educated elite would play a crucial role in articulating resistance in legal and philosophical terms. In the heart of Boston stood the Old State House, the center of colonial government. From this building, laws were debated, taxes enforced, and royal authority made visible to the public. Proclamations were read aloud from its balcony to crowds gathered below, turning political decisions into public events. The Old State House embodied British rule, but it also became a focal point of colonial frustration as new taxes and regulations were imposed from London. This building increasingly symbolized the distance between imperial power and local consent. It was here that governance felt immediate and where resentment toward that governance took shape. Just beyond the streets of government lay Boston Common, one of the oldest public spaces in the colonies. In the early 1700s, it served many roles at once: grazing land, gathering place, training ground for militia, and site of public punishment or celebration. British soldiers drilled there in full view of townspeople, a daily reminder of imperial presence. Ordinary life and political tension existed side by side, often unspoken but deeply felt. Boston Common became a shared stage where authority and resistance quietly confronted each other. Together, these institutions shaped how power was learned, displayed, and contested. They nurtured leaders, enforced laws, and brought politics into everyday life. As tensions with Britain intensified, the ideas debated in classrooms, the laws proclaimed in government halls, and the experiences shared in public spaces converged, preparing Boston to become a center of revolutionary change. By the early 1770s, Boston had become the epicenter of colonial resistance, a city where political tension no longer simmered quietly but erupted into open defiance. The streets, taverns, and meeting halls of Boston provided the setting for events that would push the American colonies toward revolution. Among the most decisive were the Boston Tea Party of 1773, the organizing efforts of the Sons of Liberty at the Green Dragon Tavern, and the mass political debates held at Faneuil Hall. The Boston Tea Party, carried out on a cold night in December 1773, was not a spontaneous riot, but a carefully planned act of protest, in response to the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company special privileges and reinforced Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Boston merchants and activists chose direct action. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, colonists boarded ships anchored in the harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. Their goal was not spectacle but symbolism, to reject taxation without representation and demonstrate that British authority could be openly challenged. The destruction of the tea shocked Britain and made reconciliation far more difficult, marking a clear step toward revolution. Behind such public acts of resistance were private spaces of organization. The Green Dragon Tavern was one of the most important. Far more than a place to drink, it functioned as an informal headquarters for the Sons of Liberty, a network of merchants, craftsmen, and laborers united by opposition to British policies. Within its private rooms, plans were made, intelligence was shared, and responses to new laws were coordinated. Here, resistance took shape through conversation, arguments sharpened by anger, fear, and a growing sense that traditional loyalty to the crown was no longer sustainable. While taverns fostered strategy, Faneuil Hall brought resistance into the open. Known as the Cradle of Liberty, it was the city's primary venue for town meetings and public debate. Crowded shoulder to shoulder, Bostonians gathered to argue over taxes, representation, and the presence of British troops. Speeches delivered here transformed private grievances into collective demands. Faneuil Hall gave legitimacy to resistance by placing it before the entire community. Together, these events and spaces reveal how revolution in Boston was built step by step. It grew from planning rooms to public halls, from protest to confrontation. In Boston, resistance was not an abstract idea, it was lived, debated, and ultimately acted upon. Today, Boston stands as a rare city where the physical landscape of the 18th century still speaks clearly to the present. Landmarks such as the Old North Church, Boston Common, Faneuil Hall, and the Old State House remain embedded in the modern city, forming a living bridge between colonial Boston, the American Revolution, and the nation that emerged from it. These buildings are not relics frozen in time. They are active witnesses to history, surrounded by skyscrapers, traffic, and daily life. The Old North Church still rises above the narrow streets of the North End, much as it did in the 1700s. Once an ordinary Anglican church, it became immortalized by a simple signal 2 lanterns warning of British troop movements. Today, it stands as a reminder that world-changing events often emerge from familiar, everyday places. So it is. Boston Common, once open grazing land and a military training ground, remains the oldest public park in the United States. Though no longer a pasture, it continues to serve its original purpose as a shared civic space. The same ground where soldiers once drilled and citizens once gathered now hosts protests, celebrations, and quiet moments of reflection, preserving its role at the heart of public life. Nearby, Faneuil Hall still draws crowds, echoing its past as a center of debate and protest. In the 18th century, voices raised within its walls helped transform frustration into action. Today, visitors walk the same floors where the language of resistance was once shaped, connecting modern democracy to its revolutionary roots. The Old State House, nearly unchanged in form, stands in striking contrast to the glass towers around it. Once the seat of colonial power, it now serves as a symbol of how authority was questioned, challenged, and ultimately redefined. Together, these landmarks show that the American Revolution was not only an event of the past. It remains woven into the everyday geography of Boston, reminding us that the modern nation was built not in abstraction, but in real places, by real people, whose legacy still stands in stone and street.